to sacrifice. So this is a contemporary illustration of human sacrifice. So how did they go about doing human sacrifice? Well, the sacrificial victim, typically a captured warrior, would climb up these steps to the temple. The main temple in the centre of Tenochtitlan was called Coatepec, which means Serpent Mountain. This relates to a myth that I'm going to tell shortly. And he would go willingly because it was a great honour to be sacrificed. And then he would be stretched over a stone and held by priests. And then the chief priest would take an obsidian dagger, cut open his chest, and then reach inside the cloven cavity of the thorax and pull out the still beating heart and offer it to the sun to ensure that the sun could continue its traversal across the sky. I did warn you that it was going to be a bit gory. I am, if anything, toning it down. Okay? So there is no doubt that this kind of human sacrifice occurred among the Aztecs. However, the contemporary accounts from the Spaniards said that they were sacrificing 20,000 people a year and storing thousands of skulls in skull racks. These skull racks do exist, but the thousands of skulls have never been found in archaeological excavations. Archaeological excavations have only revealed fewer than about 700 bodies in the temple precinct that may have been sacrificial victims. It's thought that maybe the Spaniards exaggerated the extent of human sacrifice in Aztec culture to justify their brutal invasion and colonization of the society. We will never know for sure, but I'm no archaeologist or historian, but I did speak with an archaeologist who is a member of the club and was told that typically archaeological evidence does trump contemporary accounts. So here we have some obsidian daggers. So these were found in the main temple, the remains of the main temple. You can see that they've got, like in a Japanese cartoon or something, little eyes and teeth on them. It's thought that these may actually be more ornamental sacrificial daggers rather than sort of practical use ones. Who knows? So, yeah. So this stone is crucial to the sacrificial ritual. It is the dismembered body of the sister of Quetzalcoatl. And it was a very important archaeological find, the second most archaeological find of the in Aztec, relating to Aztec culture ever. It was found in the 1970s in the basement of the main cathedral in the center of Mexico City. They were doing some electrical work and they turned up this, and they knew that this was the goddess Quetzalcoatl, difficult name to say, which means painted bells, which is a relatively nice name as Aztec god names go. And this stone was located at the bottom of the temples where the sacrifices to Quetzalcoatl took place. And this relates to a myth in Aztec mythology whereby who was known as got her name here, Coatlicue, which means Serpent Skirt. Another spooky name, but serpents represent fertility. She was sweeping a temple at the top of the mythical mountain Coatepec, which means Serpent Mountain, and somehow some feathers fell upon her, or another story is that she tucked them under her belt, and she became with child. And for some reason, her daughter, whose name means painted bells, depicted here, was furious about this and rallied her brothers, sons of Serpent Skirt, from around, and they swarmed the mountain and decapitated their mother, Serpent Skirt. In retaliation to this, the god Quetzalcoatl leapt from his mother's womb, fully grown, an adult, and dismembered painted bells and threw her down the mountain. And so the human sacrifice atop the temple in the center of Mexico City, Tenochtitlan, was a reenactment, a daily reenactment of this mythological event, with painted bells representing the moon and Huitzilopochtli representing the triumph of the sun over the moon. So there was none of this yin-yang, make everything balanced and nice and cozy and mystic auras and things like that with the Aztecs. Their attitude was, the gods are out there to get us, we've got to sacrifice things to them to get them to do what we need them to do, like stopping the sun going out. Every day is a battle between the sun and the moon, so that we don't get benighted. And so in finding this stone in the 1970s, the experts in Aztec culture knew that the Grand Temple of the Aztecs could not be far away. So here's a picture showing this story. So here we've got Serpent Skirt. Once she was decapitated, apparently her head was replaced with 2 serpent heads. And as well as having a skirt made of snakes, she wore a necklace made of hands, hearts and skulls. That is the mother of the nation, the mother of God, so the equivalent of the Virgin Mary. And here we've got painted bells dismembered, and here we've got Huitzilopochtli leaping from his mother's womb to take on his brothers. It's pretty clear that this myth relates to some intertribal warfare that must have occurred among the Aztecs while they were in camp somewhere.
The painted bells has 2 heads as well.
Yeah, it looks like it, doesn't it? Yeah. Oh no! I think that's the head there, and then that's one arm and that's the other. Yeah, clever clogs. So here we have a model of the temple. So this temple was then found by the cathedral in the centre of Mexico City. I was fortunate enough to visit it. You will notice that it's got multiple layers, and this was because the Aztecs, to show how important the temple was to them, say they would build another temple over it. So in, say, European culture, we sort of have really old churches and keep on extending them. In Japan, they like to knock down old shrines and then build a brand spanking new one to show how much they venerate the gods, hence the Grand Temple of Ise, the Aztecs would build a new shell over it to expand the temple. And a wonderful thing about this from an archaeological point of view is that as they were building the new shell, they would chuck sacrifices in between the 2 layers. So when they were excavating this temple, they've got this like huge museum full of old stuff that tells us all sorts of things about the Aztecs. So it was an amazing archaeological find. Here on the top of the temple, we have two temples. This one on the right is for Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird, god of war. Of equal importance to the Aztecs was Tlaloc, who was the god of rain. Now, you might like to think that the god of rain would be nicer than the god of war, but that is not to be. He is a very old god, so the Aztecs inherited gods from previous Mesoamerican cultures. So the Aztecs weren't like the crowning achievement of Mesoamerica or anything, they just happened to be the culture that was in charge at the time of the invasion by the Spaniards. Agriculture was very important to the Aztecs, and so was rain. And the Aztecs believed that thunder was caused by pots breaking in the sky to allow water to pour out of it. And the mode of sacrifice to Tlaloc, which is this fellow here. So Tlaloc is typically depicted as having goggle eyes and fangs, because that's what your nice neighbourly rain god should look like, of course, goggle-eyed and fanged. They would sacrifice children to Tlaloc, so child sacrifice. And when children were being led to be sacrificed, sometimes by drowning, if they cried, then that was considered good news because the tears symbolised the rain falling. So, let's move on to the next god.
Can anyone make a modest proposal? Sorry.
This is Tezcatlipoca.
As drawn by Matt Groening.
This is an Aztec Codex. This is from one of the Aztec Codex. So this is an original Aztec drawing of Tezcatlipoca. Key features of Tezcatlipoca. So his name means smoking mirror, and this relates to his relationship with night, obsidian, sorcery, divination, dark things, like the things we've been talking about haven't already been rather dark. But no, this is the god of darkness. One of the key features of him is this black stripe around his face, and another one is his funny looking foot, where his foot is replaced by an obsidian mirror. So they would also use obsidian for mirrors, and this was used as a means of divination. So, how did they sacrifice to Tezcatlipoca? So the way they sacrificed to Tezcatlipoca is that they would choose a particularly fine example of a captive warrior, and they would treat him as a god for 1 year. And people would worship him as though they were worshipping Tezcatlipoca himself. And the Aztecs had two calendars. One was the calendar that related to actual days, and that lasted 365 days. And then they had another calendar, which was the ritual calendar, which consisted of 13 months of 20 days each. And for the last 20 days, the last ritual month of this year of being worshipped as a god, he would spend with 4 beautiful maidens who had been treated as goddesses for a year. And he was married to them, all 4 of them, and their connubial activities symbolised a period of fertility at the end of a period of drought. And then they would, of course, cut him open and rip his heart out, as is usual, and they would pick the next ripped captive warrior to do the next year of being worshipped as a god. Right, so, who's this chap? This is the god of spring, the time of little fluffy bunnies and chicks and Easter eggs and things like that. But not for the Aztecs. So this is Xipe Totec. Right, why does he look a bit funny? What's this thing over his head? That is a flayed human skin.
You realise what symbol is for it?
Yes. So top tip, don't put that on your Easter card. So the flayed skin to the Aztecs represented the husk of newly growing wheat. And the way that skin is sloughed off from snakes and things like that. And his name means Our Lord the Flayed One. And the lost skin represented renewal. And the way they did sacrifice for this fellow was they would take a sacrificial victim, lash him to a wooden frame, and then fire arrows at him until, and the blood dripping down the sacrificial victim represented the rain falling in spring. And then, when he had met his inevitable demise, they flayed him, and then a priest would wear his skin for 20 days. So it's a dirty job that someone's got to do it, wearing these flayed skins.
But they're quite good at curing these flayed skins. You know.
Good. I don't think we know actually.
Otherwise, it's going to get a bit smelly.
Yeah. So now we can take a look at the nice god. This is Quetzalcoatl. Whose name means feathered serpent. You might have heard of Quetzal feathers, brightly coloured feathers from Central America. So that's where the word comes from. Quetzal is a Nahuatl word. Nahuatl was the language of the Aztecs. And the eating somebody thing there is a bit incidental. The main thing is that it's a serpent who has feathers. And this was the god of life, wisdom, and light. So a relatively nice god. And to the extent that he wasn't so keen on sacrifice. So he did people typically sacrifice things like butterflies and rabbits to Quetzalcoatl. Some even suspect that he objected to human sacrifice altogether, but he probably actually would think that that was taking this sort of woke warrior thing too far. It was like political correctness gone mad. He just sort of wanted them to tone it down a bit on the human sacrifice front. And as a result, he was expelled from Mesoamerica by the other gods. And it is thought, there's also another story that he was expelled from Mesoamerica for sharing chocolate with humans. Small price to pay, as far as I'm concerned. And there is a wonderful story, which is largely debunked, but worth telling because it's such a good story, that there was an Aztec legend that Quetzalcoatl had been banished to the east, which was down to them, and when he was also supposed to be light-skinned, and there was a prophecy that he would return in a year that went by the label one reed. And that corresponded to the day that the calendar year commenced on the ritual calendar. So they were named after a number and an object. And a year would be named after the day in the ritual calendar that he arrived. In 1519, the year that the Spaniards arrived, happened to be a one-reed year, which is when Quetzalcoatl was prophesied to return, and he was supposed to be light-skinned. So there was some talk at the time that the Aztecs thought that Cortes and the Spaniards returning was the return of their god Quetzalcoatl. However, the Spaniards probably ponged to high heaven, wearing as they were boots and doubloons and stuff in tropical heat, probably not like an Aztec god at all. And it seems as if it was more of a vanity thing by the Spaniards rather than anything that's been recorded in Aztec documents. But it's a really good story. So why did I, out of all the Aztec Pantheon of 400 gods, talk about primarily these four gods? Huitzilopochtli, Tezcatlipoca, Xipe-Totec, and Quetzalcoatl. These were known as the four Tezcatlipocas. Goodness knows why it's not the four Huitzilopochtlis, because they were his patron gods. But no, in the Aztec Pantheon, these were considered to be the creator gods, the gods who created the world. I think their creation myth was more complex than that, but I never really managed to get my head around it. And so they're sort of four aspects of the same thing, and they each have a colour associated with them. So Huitzilopochtli was associated with blue, the hummingbirds. Tezcatlipoca was the god of darkness, so he was symbolised by black. Xipe-Totec was associated with red, perhaps because people after they've been flayed go red. And Quetzalcoatl, because he was relatively nice, was associated with white. And then they were each associated with one of the cardinal points of the compass. So Huitzilopochtli being south, as we've talked about, Tezcatlipoca with the north, Xipe-Totec east, Quetzalcoatl the west, so the opposite direction to which he was banished in. And Aztec religious symbolism is got a great deal of this kind of technical, this symbolises that, this is associated with that, these things going on. It would, just like a tiny aspect of it could occupy a 40-minute talk, so I'm not going to sweat that. So, looking back at this, one other thing to mention on the whole sacrifice thing. Although the Aztecs did a lot of sacrificing of other things, a really important thing to them was self-sacrifice. So they did a lot of like cutting and piercing their earlobes and their noses with thorns, and when children went to school they were cut and had thorns dragged over them and things like this to do sort of sacrifices themselves because they're so grateful to the gods. It's so important to keep the gods happy and repay them for the sacrifices that they made to create the earth. So the conquest of the Aztecs. So Cortes and about 500 Spanish, so there was a Spanish leader, they'd come over from, I think it was Cuba. They came over to what is now the Mexican coast, the Yucatan Peninsula, and they heard about this great empire in Tenochtitlan, and the sort of story is that Cortes and 500 soldiers managed to to invade the Aztec Empire and defeat them single-handedly. What actually happened was that Cortes was very adept at fomenting civil war. So he went around various tribes. He found a couple of shipwrecked Spaniards. One had gone native and fought against the Spaniards in their war of colonization, but another one had learnt a Mayan language, and then with the help of a local woman who they called Donna Marina, who spoke Mayan and Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, he was able to go around various tribes who resented paying tribute to the Aztecs and drum up support for a civil war. And they went and invaded Tenochtitlan, which of course was vulnerable, needing to have fresh water piped in, and was subject to siege by being in the middle of a lake and being reliant on a lot of imported food. The Spaniards, it's a complicated story, but the Spaniards allied with the Tlaxcalans as well. So this enclave that they had left to fight ritual battles with, Cortes was able to form an alliance with them, and they were then able to defeat the Aztecs. Perhaps the main influence, though, in defeating the Aztecs was smallpox. So the Mesoamericans had no defense against smallpox whatsoever, and once it was introduced, about 40% of them died of smallpox within about a year. Absolute tragic. And the Spanish, unlike the Aztecs, were not interested in taking on other gods, but in supplanting the local Aztec gods with their own monotheism. So there is this stone in the center of Mexico City at an important archaeological site that says that it was here that the Spaniards, Cortes defeated the Aztecs, and it says it was neither a triumph nor a defeat, it was the painful birth of the mestizo people that is the Mexico of today. Because the Mexicans are not just like Spanish colonials, they are the blend of Spanish culture and Aztec culture, Mesoamerican culture. And when I had the good fortune to visit Mexico City, and it was quite clear there that there was strong Spanish influences, but equally strong Aztec influences, and this shows through in things like Aztec art. There's also a few words that we've taken from the Nahuatl language. For example, coyote is a Nahuatl word. Tomato is from tomatl, which is a Nahuatl word. But crucially, chocolate comes from the Aztec chocolatl. Chocolate wasn't invented by the Aztecs. It was invented by the Mayans like 1,000 years ago. But it was the word that we use for it derives from an Aztec word. So, that is everything I had to say. Any questions?
Many thanks, Tim. Do we have any questions, Bobby?
Dispute over the authority on skulls. That if you leave large mammal bones in the UK lying around for a couple of years, depending on the acidity that they're gone. Furthermore, Karamojo Bell, one of the leading ivory hunter of the turn of the century in British South Africa, said that whenever he returned to places where he'd made successful kills, only the large bones remained. And then several years after that, there'd be nothing. So the fact that you can't find anything doesn't mean that they're not there. It just means that you can't find anything.
What's the club policy on human sacrifice?
You volunteering?
Yes, I am actually.
I might nominate a few people.
I went to one of those schools where
Clayton.
Yes.
So part of these guys are out that had a year of being treated like a god and then they're sacrificed. Were they aware they were going to be sacrificed?
Oh yes.
You know, did they
yes.
saw it as a sort
yeah,
of
they saw it as a
trade
great.
off?
It was supposed to be seen as a great honour. It's open to debate whether every single one did view it as a great honour, but yes.
You said
I
they
feel
were
a Woody
drawn
Allen
from-
film coming on.
Yeah.
They were drawn from, you said, from conquered
Yeah,
or defeated warriors, so
yeah.
it wasn't their own people root deeply within that belief system volunteering for
Yeah.
it. Was
Although the other tribes had similar belief systems.
right.
The gods weren't just Aztec gods. The gods were Mesoamerican gods. and like different tribes chose different patron gods and would gladly adopt gods from other tribes. Sarah.
I was wondering, snakes seem to play a big part in their injury, and also I was their snake god, the snakes are everywhere because they're so important.
They probably did have a snake god, although I don't specifically know of one. They do have gods of all sorts of things. One of the most intriguing things I saw in the museum next to the big temple was a snake mat. It was carved from stone, and it was snakes interwoven with each other to look like a mat. Quite a thing to see.
There you go.
I was interested by was it east is down, is that correct? Or east is up? No, down.
East is down, so the south is on the left.
Okay, because coming from the southern hemisphere, I believe that south is up, and many of us do believe that. But, the maps are all drawn wrongly. But so I was intrigued by that aspect of Aztec culture.
Yeah. So that Aztec. So you've got the antipedal thing of turning the map upside down. The Aztecs show how arbitrary that the sort of European way of viewing the world is.
Well, to a Martian, the globe is whatever,
Yeah.
It's
Indeed.
a position, but does that come from like a long tradition in Mexican culture or Mayan culture? Or?
I don't know. Presumably, they probably didn't dream it up themselves. They seem to be more interested in dreaming up ways of waging war.
Yeah.
Ask about the Aztec language. I was really impressed by your pronunciation of the Aztec gods. How do we know how they pronounce the words?
Well, people still speak Nahuatl. So I even have a colleague who speaks Nahuatl. So yeah, it's not a dead language like Latin. People still speak the. I think it's still like a living language. Probably changed considerably. Yeah.
The Spanish went on with priests who were quite literate, and they recorded it. I mean, most of what we know about the Aztecs, besides archaeology, is they recorded actually quite a lot of detail.
Yeah, so they got Jesuit monks to. So there was a mission to go over and record the Aztec way of life before they died. Yeah, so they did lots of drawings, and then they wrote annotations in Spanish because the Aztecs. Writing, that's a good idea. And so they got scribes writing about everyday life in the Aztec world.
One more question?
Spanish men, this is more a confession of ignorance than a question. The Spanish men, which I used to think was the Spanish main sea lake, but actually, in fact, the Spanish main is the Spanish mainland. And the port the ship was built from is up on the Yucatan Peninsula. I can't remember its name now. It was very important. It's non-existent now. And the sea lanes went to the north of Jamaica, where Fleming and Royal Western had houses, and that was where the pirates lay in wait because of the galleons left from that port in the Yucatan Peninsula from the Spanish main.
Thank you.
Well, just to say thank you again, Tim. Flay your hands.
Very good.
Thanks to all of you watching at home. If that worked for you, see you soon.